This is Robbie, and well, this is the last video I'm making based on the course, the basic course Making Exhibitions, which I developed in the 80s. Of course, there will be more videos on this topic. Just subscribe on our channel to stay informed. In the video I made about guiding, I mentioned this newspaper article. As a result of this article, I received a call from the Public Service Department of the Amsterdam Rijksmuseum, you know, the very famous one. They had a large department that was busy figuring out how best to approach the public. But they wanted advice from an outsider. As I made clear in my previous videos, real museum people, they have university education. They think from the product. I come from the gallery world, I think from the visitor. So, what kind of visitors come during the holidays and the weekends? Families. Parents or grandparents with children and grandchildren. One of the things I noticed in the Rijksmuseum was that after a renovation, the signs indicating how to walk to the toilets no longer corresponded with reality. If you follow those signs in the new exhibition, you ended up in a dead end. For an adult, that's not such a big problem. But when your child has just learned to go to the toilet, a search can result in wet pants. And that's not so nice. So, speaking about children, young children discover the world by feeling everything, by smelling it and putting it in their mouth. When they enter a museum, they see the most exhibited object is the sign, "Do not touch." Well, they cannot read, but they see the sign. Unfortunately, it's not made clear anywhere why you are not allowed to touch something. And by the way, one of the reasons is that our skin is always greasy, even if you just wash your hands. When thousands of visitors touch a painting for a moment, it has a terrible consequences. When you make this clear, such a sign works much better. In each case, as a result of my findings, the foundation I was working for at that time came up with a proposal to set up a national museum study, and we decided to do so. The research consisted of two parts. On the one hand, there were about, I think, 50 volunteers who liked to visit museums, and the other hand, I would visit museums myself. During a first meeting, it was explained what the research entailed and what its importance was, and I made it clear that we were interested in comments to improve the public friendliness of the institution. The media often pay attention to exhibitions, but then almost exclusively write about what is being exhibited, rarely how something is being exhibited. But experience shows that how something is presented has a major influence on how people experience the visit. Often neither employees nor visitors are aware of this influence. We expected that research will yield many useful tips, and that was indeed the result. The volunteers were reimbursed for the travel cost, tickets, photo cost and consumptions. For each visit they wrote a report on. When people saw something special, good or bad, they could take a picture of it. The report was based on the questionnaire I had drawn up after I had visited a number of museums myself and encountered the most wonderful things there. In a museum that was nicely decorated in itself, I came across a cupboard with a circuit breaker in a corridor, the door of which was slightly open so that any child could put on an entire department without power. Subsequently, the questionnaire to be completed was shown, and an explanation was given to the questions. Why I want to know this, why is this important? There were a total of 15 topics that we drew attention to, and for each topic there were several specific questions. The first topic was about, among other things, the R1 and the R3 text. R1 text are the directions outside the museums, and tree text are directions in folders. This is, for example, the questionnaire for the topic 11 about how child-friendly the institute was. Well, there were a lot of interesting comments. In some museums, a lot of attention is paid to visitors, but there are also many museums where the experts are solely concerned with the exhibition itself. The rest is often left to the volunteers. A regularly recurring complaint turned out that the horizontal display cases are a problem for short people and for children. But someone had also been to a museum where a ladder had been placed next to such a lane display. So it must not have been a trend yard like this one here on the picture, but it was handy and public friendly, and it's obvious a solution, but one should be aware of the problem. Meanwhile, this is also a good example of how to present such a report in case they ask you to write one. You can write that short people cannot see the content of the laying display cases. You can also write that it will be good if there was a small staircase near the horizontal display cases for smaller people. Then you name a shortcoming, but immediately providing a solution, and then it's a positive contribution. The museums I visit were random selected. The Netherlands has a museum guide with more than 1,000 museums. I opened the guide somewhere, blindly pointed out to a museum, and from that museum I visit every 10th subsequent museum. This meant that I really ended up in all kinds of museums. Because we worked from the same questionnaire, the results overlapped considerably. But there were several things that stood out to me more. This is of course because I had prepared the questionnaire, but also because they were real visitors who came to enjoy the museum, while I visit the museum mainly to discover their strength and weakness. On our Patreon site you can read more about research. You will find also the entire questionnaire that is useful to assess your own exhibition space in terms of public friendliness. Still, I would like to mention a few things that particularly stood out to me. Firstly, in practice it appears that people do not always know that for materials with fibers such as paper, dryness is much worse than moisture. Paper materials are fragile and therefore often stored behind glass. Unfortunately, the humidity is not always well regulated. It is often too hot and too dry. With regard to the storage of paper, people are especially warned against humidity because this can cause all kinds of damage to the paper, including due to fungi and all this kind of things. However, if paper is kept too dry, the fibers will shrink and lose cohesion, eventually breaking up into dust. I didn't know that until I visited a restoration department where very old material was restored. The restorer told me that he can restore material that is very moist, but not material that has been stored to dry. That's irreparable. Since then I paid particular attention to this when visiting exhibitions. My advice is to ensure that there is a clear indication of the humidity of a standard, especially when materials are stored behind glass. A simple hygrometer in a place where people look daily is sufficient. What I also noticed is that people regularly deviate from the decimal system. Distances and speeds in miles, weights in pounds, temperatures in Fahrenheit. The big problem is that the constant need to convert and the fact that in different countries several of those size indications can have a different value, but also within the same country the unit of the measurement can have a different value over the years. Therefore, it is strongly recommended to use the decimal system. It's also recommended to have an English translation or summary of all text because a reasonable proportion of the visitors often come from elsewhere. So, and speaking of text, after a visit to an exhibition, people are generally tired. But the tiredness must come and must be caused because the offer is so interesting. Unfortunately, the fatigue also regularly arises because of the artistic design that has been unleashed on the text. Design can greatly improve a presentation, including text, but only when the design is functional. The design is often very artistic and the resulting texts are barely legible. The last example from this series on making exhibitions is about working from a synergetic setup. And the real-life example I know best is how I set up the Terracotta Park Museum near Hoi An, in the middle of Vietnam. That was actually easy to do because it was a completely new museum and I didn't have to change any existing customs. So let me start with describing the situation. 100 years ago, Hoi An was one of the Vietnam's largest international ports. Businessmen from Japan, China and various other countries, their branches and warehouses were there. This required not only many roof tiles but also a lot of utensils, and the pottery village did excellent business. Unfortunately, Hoi An lost its status and more recently the village had another major problem. The ovens used to bake are situated as it were in their living room. For roof tiles the temperature must be very high and that resulted in a very unhealthy situation. So the government decided that it wasn't allowed anymore for baking at a high temperature, with the result that they could only produce small objects that needed a lower temperature to bake. This greatly reduced the chance of survival because now they became independent on selling to tourists. A village-born architect Nguyen, who runs a successful business in Ho Chi Minh City, decided to build a terracotta park museum as an extra tourist attraction to attract many more tourists to the village. The museum was placed in the center of the village, Nha Van Hoa, which means culture house. The museum is a very beautiful place, outside as well inside. It was even named the most beautiful new building in Vietnam in 2016, so it was a nice place to work. However, the museum had to be self-supporting and it was not intended to compete with the small shops. So they invited some people to write a policy to run the museum. The policy proposed by me was selected, and because it was completely different setup, I was asked to start the museum myself. Well, I said I don't speak Vietnamese. They said, well, there's no problem because you have to hire the staff yourself. So, and then you hire people that speak English. So that was not a big problem. Well, everyone can see the existing ideas to generate income from museums in just about all museum shops. They are full of small popular items. That's nice, but if we wanted to generate income in this way in our museum, it will be at the expense of the local village shops. So I opted for a highly commercial synergistic approach, which I can best explain how it works with practical examples. It's customary in museum to have the sales department, the guided tour department, the restaurant, the children's activities department, the PR department, the supervision department, in short, a lot of departments. And specialized people work in all those departments, and in practice it appears that the departments are not always well coordinated. Since we worked without subsidy, I had to see that the museum create income. And this meant that I had to work from quite a commercial setup. In general, people think that to be commercial, one has to be act very popular, but it's in fact the opposite. A popular polity is following the market. A commercial approach is to create markets. For this, you create a strategy, and to realize that strategy, there are tactics. Let me explain. We had three main sources of income: school groups, business groups, and the market. To give an example, schools have little money, so our activities were very cheap. We made no money yet from that. But the children always got money for an ice cream and a drink, and 500 children convert quite a lot in an afternoon, which is why we did not outsource the restoration. For adults and business group, we had different activities. How commercial and synergistic the setup was becomes clear from the personal polity. I only hired professional guides, who all had to be able to work with children and also had a specific skill. But it meant I had guides working everywhere, even at the cash register. I didn't have the usual doorman. Everyone who came in was met by a guide, and depending on where they came from, they received a nice brochure, and then the visitor came through the gallery. And what kind of work did they see there? Indeed, the original of the brochure. From the gallery, they walked through the museum. And so I didn't have attendants there, but guides walking around. Guides who could lay the groundwork in stories for the continuation in the restoration. There were no advertisements there, but beautiful, informative posters about the terracotta and the Vietnamese history. Visitors could then walk through the market to the workshops where the craftsmen worked. In that market, the image of the posters and the jewels of the ancient times could be seen. And again, very commercial. The presentation that people saw first were the most expensive images. If you start with cheap and then the rest is more expensive, it doesn't work. Because then they see everything is more expensive. But if you start with expensive, then the rest is cheaper. And that's fairly simple, a sales principle. People often think that they can lure customers with cheap offers, but that set the standards very low. And we wanted to sell high, expensive, quality artwork. So the nice thing is that when people give a nice brochure for free at the entrance, the question often arises why we can give it for free, after which we say very honestly that it's an investment, and visitors just like that and therefore cooperate. The point is, however, that it only works well if, for example, they are sitting in a restaurant and having a question about such a beautiful poster. The person who brings the drink can immediately tell it enthusiastically what it is about and those things. That is the principle of synergistic setup. Everyone knows the museum and can talk enthusiastically about it. When a visitor has a question, an expert does not have to be called in the first to, oh, I don't know that, I have to ask that. No, they know. And since everyone could do guiding, we were also able to receive unexpected large group. And yes, I was director, but even if the need was high, I also did guided tours, which was actually more fun than being director. To start a museum, you need to have very different characteristics than to keep a museum running. So once the museum was running well, I stopped because I'm not the director. And then I moved to Hanoi to advise and to help other museums in Vietnam with the development of educational programs. And then I got a message from Da Nang, where one of my former trainees was started an Art for Children gallery. And she is one, and she asked me whether I could help to start up, and then I said, well, that's great, because maybe 40 years ago I started with a children gallery and making exhibitions for children, so it's nice to make the circle around and to do it again. And that's how I came to work for a Vietnam Cultural Exchange Company. Thank you for watching, and see you on Patreon, where people can go with questions about exhibitions and projects they are working on themselves. See you in another video. Bye.